I'm going to tell you about clinical science, both the most significant advance in the last decade and what might happen in the decade yet to come. And to my mind, the decade's most significant clinical advance has been characterised by highly cited publications, marked economic impacts, and the recognition in prestigious awards. And I've tried to work out, from what I know, although obviously I'm prejudiced, how one would relate what I think is the most important advance to these things. And with all advances, there are both positive features and weaknesses, and I'm going to just give you a brief explanation of both of these. And actually weaknesses are important, not because advances necessarily are unrecognised, but we change and make better the future by realising the problems of the present. And so I have selected, and I'm sure this is right, and I've been slightly anxious hearing the previous talks, that to my mind the biologics revolution has been the biggest change in my professional career, and almost certainly the advance of my professional lifetime, as well as being the advance of this decade. And this is the widespread use of biologic treatments for inflammatory arthritis, not only rheumatoid arthritis but also ankylosing spondylitis and psoriatic arthritis, and now extending also into connective tissue diseases. And so let's now look at the evidence for this being an important advance. And I'm going to first of all talk about highly cited papers. Now, many years ago I used to edit our specialist journal, and I recognised that if papers got 1 or 2 citations, I was pretty pleased, the average citation for a paper being between 0 and 1, and 5 citations was good, 10 is very good, and most of us, if we get 100 citations to a paper in our career, feel very pleased with it. And these are papers around the biologics which have got over 1,000 citations, so they're in a different order of magnitude. The most important one is the one at the bottom here, which was by Peter Lipsky, which was the New England Journal paper on the ATTRACT trial, which has got over 1,500 citations. And there's a couple of other interesting points, with the exception of the TB study, which was an observational study of a risk of these drugs. They are all clinical trials funded by industry, and obviously citations relate to how long you've been the paper's been published, and although Joe Edwards only had 750 or thereabouts citations at the moment, as his paper's a bit more recent, it will hopefully within 10 years catch up and will also cross the 1,000 barrier. And for those of you interested in small things here, all of these papers come from either the New England Journal or the Lancet, which is how these particular journals retain their preeminence by selecting what is going to be the best science of the future. Costs are absolutely vital, and the next, I think, reason to think the biological revolution has clearly changed things is shown in the expenditure on drugs. And this comes from a bit of work published in 2007, and it relates to sales in the last quarter of 2006 in millions of euros. And the 2 points to make are that there's a quantitative difference which is dramatic between the conventional disease-modifying drugs, with gold, as you can see, selling either as orethiomalate or as Aranafin approximately 1 billion euros. The more recent and widespread used DMARDs having sales between 14 and 48 million euros, and the biologics that were then available having sales between 10 and 20-fold of this size. Massive amounts of money being spent on these extremely important drugs, so an enormous impact on the economics of arthritis. Now, I work in the NHS, and we have a whole series of regulatory environments, and the government is to a certain extent a monopoly and a monopoly employer, and the NHS publishes regularly what it's doing, and this on the left of this slide shows the highest selling drugs in, or the highest expenditure in drugs in 2009, and although at the bottom cardiovascular disease, atorvastatin is the most important drug, 2 of these drugs are used for arthritis, and they are the biologics adalimumab and etanercept. The other in between those is also a biologic used for cancer. And so clearly there is an enormous importance here, but there are national differences, and if one looks at international comparisons on the right, published by the UK National Audit Office from data collected in 2008, this looks at drug costs per million euro and also the percent use of biologics in different countries. Clearly costs vary, and also the population sizes vary, but it's very interesting that the USA has 21% of its patients on biologics and Australia has only 1%, and the UK is a little bit concerned, the patient groups around 8%. The interesting point is whether this actually translates to differences in clinical outcomes. However, and then finally I'm going to show, just to mention prestigious awards. This picture on the right here has already done the rounds, and it shows, I think, a mythical picture of Tiny and Mark Feldman in the laboratory, where clearly their work is actually done in their offices, persuading people to do things in the field. However, they've had enormose success in terms of achieving marks of appreciation of the work that I think they have been considered to lead. Both have achieved knighthoods in the UK, and both have been elected to members of the Royal Society as Fellows of the Royal Society. The Royal Society, as you probably know, was founded in the time of Isaac Newton, and has an enormous historic I suppose, cachet with it. And also they won a number of important prizes, including the Albert Lasker Clinical Research Award and the Crafoord Prize of the Royal Swedish Academy. So far, the largest prize has eluded them, but one never knows whether they will yet receive further awards. Now let me now show you an example of what happens with infliximab in rheumatoid arthritis. The Lipsky paper, which is the most highly cited paper in the field. And this just looks on the left of this, the ACR responder rate, and you'll probably be familiar with this data, but it shows that in placebos you get a very low rate of ACR placebo responses at 20, 50 and 70, but if you give people infliximab and other biologics show the same, you get between 40 ACR 20 responses and 20 ACR 70 responses, 40, 30 and 20 is often said. You also see from this paper clear evidence of X-ray progression being markedly reduced and often improved. So the placebo group on the right of this slide in green shows persisting X-ray progression and little improvement, whereas patients treated with infliximab in this study showed marked reduction in progression and marked increases in improvement. And there is no doubt that TNF inhibition is more effective than any preceding treatment in this particular setting. A recent meta-analysis, a network meta-analysis, which put all trials published up until the end of 2008 for the key drugs which were then licensed at that time, is shown here. Interestingly, this particular meta-analysis has been published both in the Canadian Medical Journal and also in the Cochrane Library with vaguely similar results, and this looks at the odds of having an ACR 50 response to treatment. And what it shows, if you look at the no change line at 1, which is the dotted line, that all the drugs with the exception of anakinra show a dramatic improvement, and the chances, the odds of having a successful response is about 5 times that of placebos. And it's very interesting why anakinra should be an outlier, and it's clearly because it doesn't work in rheumatoid arthritis in a particularly effective way. But what is interesting is it has been shown to be highly effective in another rare group of disorders, the autoinflammatory diseases, and this shows a single pair of patients from one of the early reports from the New England Journal of Medicine by Hawkins and Lackman, who work at the Royal Free in London. And this looks at changes in amyloid A protein, which is the most sensitive acute phase respondent, which is highly switched on. And when patients receive anakinra, here they show a rapid, immediate and sustained fall. And so in all the autoinflammatory disorders, anakinra is amazingly effective. It's also effective in gout. So its lack of effect in rheumatoid arthritis suggests it's the wrong target, not a drug which doesn't work. However, I'm also going to share with you some inconsistencies, because like all advances, it has weaknesses as well as strength, and it's important to realise this. And the most important one is that RA is improved, it's stabilised, but so far it's not cured. And let me show you 2 bits of data which go from that. On the left here you'll see mean death scores of patients established on long-term treatment, and there are 3 groups here. The BSR-BR stands for the British Society for Rheumatology Biologics Register, people on infliximab and etanercept, and the OSG stands for the British Rheumatoid Outcome Study Group, a disastrous name because it doesn't quite rhyme as an acronym. And this shows people just on DMARDs, and effectively there is no difference between people on DMARDs and people on biologics when they're stabilised. Another piece of data which goes along with this is from a register in Kent, which is just between London and the south coast, and this looks at DAS28 again on people receiving TNF inhibitors who were on long-term treatment, people on disease-modifying drugs alone, and people who had no particular suppressive treatment so far, showing that there is broadly similar DAS levels at a range which is not a cure. And so, although it's possible to show biologics are dramatically effective, they don't really necessarily cure patients. I'm now going to show one other slide, which some small piece of work which we did, where we happen to have DAS28 scores going back in time for a long time before people started treatment. And each patient shows the same story, that the DAS with 6 years before treatment improves or get worsens as they start to flare. They then have a flare, they go on they're given a TNF, they show a dramatic improvement, but in effect they go back to where they started off. So it's regression to the mean. It takes the worst of rheumatoid away, but doesn't put you back to a different disease status at the end of treatment. And let me just show you one final systematic review, again, which we published this year, but there are many similar pieces of research out there comparing anti-TNF with methotrexate or combination DMARDs involving methotrexate against methotrexate monotherapy in newly diagnosed rheumatoid arthritis. And although both sets of trials show an improvement, the improvement is broadly similar. Now, these are not head-to-head trials, these are indirect comparisons, and therefore there's all sorts of complexities with the analysis one needs to put on one side, but there isn't clear evidence that biologics, as currently used, are dramatically better than the best possible conventional treatment. And if we just look at disability and damage scores, this shows the same thing. Now, one needs to have a little bit of caution, because here we're not interpreting head-to-head trials, and what we clearly need are head-to-head trials of the best possible conventional treatment against the best possible biological treatment. However, for the moment, TNF inhibitors and intensive DMARDs appear equivalent in early rheumatoid arthritis, which has obvious consequences for the health economic issues. So I'm going to close the point about the new biological treatments. There is no doubt these are fantastic treatments, but they're not perfect. And I'm now going to try and talk about likely breakthroughs to the future, which is far more dangerous. The BMJ, the leading British medical journal, published what readers voted they thought the top advances had been since 1840, when the journal was formed. They're shown here on the right. And interestingly, they're mainly public health and general measures, sanitation being top of the list, and DNA structure being the one scientific major advance within there. No one, I'm sure, would doubt about these, but they're very broad brush issues. And so if one's looking to what is likely to be important in the next decade, there's going to be several characteristic features of such improvements. And the first one is going to be, I think, that they have to deal with major unresolved clinical problems. Rare diseases are very important to the people who have them, but what really advances medicine is solving major problems. They have to have widespread relevance. It can't just be a major disease treated in a particular way in a small group of patients. They have to really change practice, just as biologics have really changed my practice, and they also have to catch the public eye. And of course, the public have to reflect, and it's very important that patients feed back the perception of what is important, because policymakers and patients may see things differently. And I think that the two big problems that I see unresolved in my practice, and I was pleased to hear the previous talk mention one of these, I think curing osteoarthritis is the most important issue in front of us. Inflammatory arthritis is an important disease, but I think by comparison osteoarthritis is dominant. And also I think understanding pain. About half the patients I see have unresolved pain, and our present approaches to it are not ideal. And I think there are two issues which I think have the potential over the next 10 or maybe longer years to make a major change. And I think one of the most important of these, I think, is going to be stem cell treatment for osteoarthritis. And the second one, I think, around imaging pain is going to be understanding what is happening by using functional MR imaging.